Good afternoon. Thank you for coming in on this sunny, remarkably, sigh of a day. I mean, I don't think any of us could take it anymore, right? So thank you for being here. My name is Jennifer New, and I'm the Associate Director of the Obermann Center. So this is what was going to be our final Obermann Conversation of the year, but we actually just added one more. So before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about that. It's actually a week from today at the same time, 4 o'clock, and it's next door at Merge. I have a few posters here for it with me. It's called Controlling Research, and it's about the federal limitations, both through legislation and lack of funding, on research into gun violence. There will be 2 University of Iowa faculty who work on issues of violence prevention and criminology, and they'll be joined in conversation with a Cedar Rapids community organizer who is focused on the relatively high number of shootings in that community. One of the faculty members, Corey Peak Asa, actually met Senator Dickey, after whom the Dickey Amendment is named, and has been increasingly part of conversations with the Centers for Disease Control on how to change that 22-year-old amendment. Today, we are happy to have with us 3 educators who are interested in how we can address the increasing interconnectedness of our world via education. They'll be helping us to understand global citizenship and how we might better balance our obligations for local and national knowledge with world knowledge. Directly on my left is Jason Harshman, who is an assistant professor of social studies and global education at the University of Iowa's College of Education. He was the 2009 New York State Social Studies Teacher of the Year. You should have like a medal, Jason.
Yeah,
you can just
that,
wear it with you. That's so cool. And he's taught abroad in Japan, Turkey, Spain, and South Korea. Alisa Meggitt in the center teaches global studies at North Central Junior High in North Liberty. And she's also taught locally at Lucas and Shimmick Elementaries. She has worked for the EPA and in the White House. I was like, wow, so maybe she'll share that with us a little bit. She was a Peace Corps volunteer in Senegal, and just earlier this month, a few weeks ago, she won the Phyllis Yeager Diversity Teaching Award from the College of Education here, of which she's an alumni, so congratulations. Thank you. And then on the far end of the table, Caleb Elfenbein was kind enough to come all the way over from Grinnell, so we very much appreciate that. They have some work that they're doing together, so it'll be very interesting to hear them as a trio, so thank you for making that trip. Caleb is an associate professor in both history and religion. He directs the Grinnell College Center for the Humanities. He and his students have been working on a digital mapping project about Islamophobia in America, and he has partnered more recently with Jason to see how this work can be shared with K-12 teachers and in classrooms, which is where Alisa comes in, and so they'll share some of this today. We're going to start with just a group question, and then I'm going to have a seat, and Jason's going to moderate for the rest of the time. But I wanted each of you to just reflect on what global citizenship means to you and within your work. So what does that term mean, and then how does that come up in your particular field or work? Thanks.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yeah, thank you very much for that question, and thank you all for being here today. It's been a real pleasure working with Jason. Jason, we actually just met for the first time, but in thinking about global citizenship in the context of public education, if you'll humor me for a couple of minutes, I just want to talk about how I figure in here and came to this question myself. My background, my studies in graduate school and what I've been teaching for a number of years is mostly about the Middle East and the study of Islam. my first week in graduate school actually was the week of September 11th in 2001. So you could imagine studying the Middle East and Islam as a religion in that moment. There was a lot to think about in terms of global citizenship. And I studied the history of the region, and a lot of my research was on how we understand the region, and especially its connections to the West. So that's been a big question for me, is these kinds of connections that we make across different parts of the world. In 2015, I started noticing that I was reading more and more about harassment and crimes that were targeting American Muslims. And I just kind of took note of this. But over the course of the year, I started to read more and more about this, and it really caught my attention. And for the first time, I really thought about doing work that was looking at the United States. So this was a little bit of a departure for me. And since that time, I've been working on a project collecting all the information that I can about political speech, about laws, about harassment and hate crimes, and a whole range of things that have to do with American Muslims. And what I have seen over that time is that things that are happening around us in this country are so intimately tied to things that are happening around the world and that relate to the place of the United States in the larger world. And so when we're thinking about global citizenship, what I've really come to more recently is that it's pretty hard to think about the idea of global citizenship without the sorts of connections that are at the heart of the work that both of you are doing and thinking about with public education. And the things that I've noticed since 2015, there tend to be many more incidents that are bias motivated in some way, targeting American Muslims when things are happening abroad. And often those things relate to the United States abroad. Not always, but often. And what ends up happening is that American Muslims are targeted because of things happening abroad that affect, say, the U.S. military or other Americans abroad. So that's one way that these connections are really important for us to think about. Another connection that's really significant is that when political discussion begins focusing on American Muslims, we see a rise in hate crimes and other kinds of incidents involving American Muslims. And often, that political discussion has a lot to do with asking the question, can Muslims ever really be American? Discussion of refugees and immigrants, all of this is really bound up with that idea, that question. Can Muslims be truly American? And that is a question that relates to how Americans connect with communities abroad, other nation states abroad, but not just nation states, other communities abroad. And it's important for my students, and I think other students, and I think all of us to consider whether we might ask the same questions about other communities, other immigrant communities, but also those who have been here for generations, as is the case for a lot of American Muslims. What kinds of connections do we identify and ask questions about? And I think that's really significant, because when we're talking about refugees, when we're talking about immigrants, we are talking about the idea that people with connections abroad, connections to other communities abroad, are somehow a threat to those of us whose connections maybe are more separated by time, or at least we think in those terms. So For me, the question of global citizenship and the work that I do and what I've seen is so bound up in connection between, making that connection between what's happening around us really locally. And the work that I've done shows that there really isn't a community in the United States where these questions aren't relevant relating to American Muslims and this question, can Muslims ever truly be American? This is relevant in every community. So this connection between what's happening around us right now is so intimately bound with what's happening abroad and what kinds of connections we have that we might not even imagine to things that are happening abroad. So that's just a little bit of background in the work that I've been doing and how I think about this question with my own students. Even when I'm teaching a class about Middle East history, how am I really emphasizing these connections between what people in this country right now are seeing and things that might have happened 100 years ago in the Middle East or in other Muslim communities abroad. So just a little bit of background and information as a way to answer that question.
One of the pieces there that Caleb was discussing that comes up often when we talk about global citizenship from conceptually as well as when we're working with students is that issue of the belonging and sort of in the legal status that is tied in with citizenship. And so these ideas of moving across borders, or when we think of the tourist or the passport and the access that gives and some of the privileges that are bound up compared to an asylum seeker or a refugee, and these movements. Global citizenship oftentimes is thought of with this very sort of elite status, but it's much more complicated. And so that often becomes a piece of that conversation, that once you add the word citizenship and all that we have come to connect with citizenship, is this inclusive? Or are we, again, creating some layers of how we think about belonging and movement of people? The other piece that we work a lot with, I have the privilege of getting to work with teachers across the state of Iowa, nationally, as was mentioned by Jennifer, internationally as well. And actually excited that we're adding South Africa, a project that just got accepted there with the Ministry of Education, so that's going to start this summer. And this idea of prejudice reduction and those biases that you mentioned, and how we bring that into the classroom, particularly in spaces where students don't have a lot of face-to-face interaction with people who they are culturally different from. There's technology and there's opportunities to make those connections, and we get to do that in classrooms, but that doesn't always necessarily mean that there's a shift in thinking if it's just that one-time activity. Just as a one-time trip abroad doesn't necessarily bring a different way of thinking about the world. And so when we talk about global citizenship education and we think about goals and objectives within education, those become pieces of a very complex puzzle. I've been looking at these changes related to geography and thinking about the rural as much more diverse than is usually given credit for when we think particularly about Iowa, and changes in population, changes in the spaces that students are interacting with outside of school, but also teachers, to talk about these topics in a classroom, but then to not actually interact in those spaces outside of the classroom can be a detriment to what students are exposed to or what they get to talk about. And that's where, of course, Alisa will be able to talk about her experiences, because when you have the opportunity to go into a classroom, it's happening all of the time. And we've been working on a project inspired by Caleb's project with junior high students. So when we think about those outcomes related to education, and I have an opportunity to move into more rural areas of Iowa, we also face resistance. Parents and community members who wonder, why are we talking about these things, as if it cannot coexist with discussions of the national and the local. And so that might be something we get to come back to later. But I wanted to make sure that Alisa had an opportunity to talk about what she does in the classroom as a teacher and what her kids are working on as well.
Thank you. Right, so global citizenship is actually what brought me to the classroom. My first career, as you mentioned, was environmental policy. I came to Iowa and I was a pioneer student in their global studies program, and I absolutely loved that program and moved out to DC and right away began volunteering with United Nations programs, thinking this is how we're going to change the world. So I went to this Earth Summit in Brazil and I thought we're going to create all these treaties and we're going to create the world that I want to grow old in. And these treaties were promulgated and I don't know that a lot happened. And then I went to another UN conference in Cairo on population, thinking we're going to empower women and we're going to, curb the world population crisis. But I didn't see tremendous results from these conferences. And then I continued to work on a national level for, the United States EPA and ultimately then the White House Task Force on Recycling for the Environmental Executive. And I worked and I worked and I worked. I thought, well, nationally we can do something. We can, change at least one country, and this is a big country. And I worked and I worked and I worked. And my last job was with the Federal Environmental Executive working on one executive order that I worked, through days like this. I remember working very, very late because I'm like, it's so important to get these environmental policies in place. And then with the change of administration, it was one of the first executive orders that died. I thought, this is crushing. And so about that time, I was in the Peace Corps, and I spent 2 years in West Africa serving as an environmental educator. And the environmental part was really prominent for me, and the educator was very much a la carte. I thought, well, if that's what I got to do. And I was working with 10 schools, and the kids were just great and fun, and I realized I enjoy them. But through the course of those 2 years, I realized that policy might not be my most effective strategy because of the constant changes. And I saw potential in education because through education, you can change attitudes and values and behaviors, and nobody can take what I teach away. And so that sat on my radar as I went back to the environmental policy scene, and we moved to Iowa. I worked for a year in the DNR, and finally I'm like, and I kept trying to do recycling in schools or compost, everything in schools. And finally I said, I'm just gonna quit and get my teaching license. So that's what I did, 14 or 15 years ago. And I became a teacher. And I can tell you, it is, in terms of global education and global citizenship, it's so powerful. It's way more powerful than United Nations conferences or working for the federal government. It's working with children. And I've been so blessed here in Iowa City to have all these after-school clubs for kids to work on child labor or animal rights or really whatever's alive in them. But really kind of the crux of why I teach and my core, like my teaching philosophy is like have the kids dream about the world that they want to grow old in and then teach them the skills that they need to create that world. And global education is kind of the centerpiece of that. So every day, I've had kids, I start the year off, one of the very first days I talk about how privileged those kids are to be sitting in the desks where they're sitting and how, they're 5% of the world's population that 95% of the world dreams to live like. And they don't know that. We live in this little fishbowl and they think that we're just average. And I'm like, you guys won the birth lottery because you're here in the United States. And I talk about how where I've traveled around the world, you can find a U.S. embassy or consulate with lines wrapped around outside the building with people dreaming, to get paperwork to come to the United States. And they don't realize that. And then we talk about the privilege of being in Iowa and having such an exceptional education system. And Iowa City, where it's one of the top, and North Liberty, where I teach, North Central's the top, And so I always try to push a context of how privileged we are. And not privileged in that we're better, that we're smarter, we're more charismatic, better looking, but that we just show up in this world with so much power that we've done nothing to earn, but we have so much power. And so for global citizenship, I really try to teach a perspective that we're just, a member, one of 7 billion members in a community, but we have incredible, immeasurable power, and that we could use it to support people around the world who, don't have an education, or don't have running water or clean water or access to medicine, or, I tell them 25,000 kids died since I seen you from not having enough food, so we talk about like how there's so much ease, in our lives here. And so I love to give kids a perspective of what life is like for other people around the world, and how we're an extreme minority. We're an extreme minority, but that we have an obligation to other people, and that we impact everybody on the planet with every dollar we spend, with every action we take here in the United States, that we have such a powerful impact on billions of people around the world. And that's my dream, is that the kids actually make that connection, that they are connected to our friends all over the planet, and that those people matter too. And one of my favorite quotes is, that the idea that some lives matter less is the root of all that's evil in the world. And I try to always impress upon kids how precious all the lives are, and how we need to be critical thinkers, and how we need to consume our media with a great deal of criticism. And we do talk a lot about Islam. And I do a lot of storytelling, because that's what I think resonates with the kids. And I tell them, honestly, I express that. When I went to the Peace Corps, when I was doing my last interview, they asked where I want to go. And I said, I'll go anywhere that's not Muslim. And I honestly expressed that. And of course, they sent me to Senegal. It's 98% Muslim. And it was my gift. And I tell the kids that I am a pacifist, but in that village of 400, I was the most violent person in that village. And the only crime that's ever been committed to me by an Arab or a Muslim would be like being overfed, or like they always have to feed you in their abundance, and it's so wonderful. And so I tell a lot of stories and try to humanize people in different parts of the world, so that our kids can see them in their full humanity, and try to break down the enemy images that they receive through our media and through even sometimes through our education system. But the systemic, messages of that we matter more, and that we need more protection, and that they're a danger or a threat to us. And so it's been really great to be able to work with Jason and to exploit your work, Caleb, with the mapping, because we have a really good after-school club that helps kids fight Islamophobia. And so they've been meeting since December. And we've got 3 groups, and they do all these neat projects to raise awareness, to embrace the complexity around Islam, to map Islam. And I can tell you the kids are loving it, and I'm enjoying it. I hope you are too. Oh, of course. Yeah. But it's been a great deal of fun. And so for a global, citizenship, I do think that working with the youth, it's such a privilege, and it's actually a lot of fun too.
One of the pieces that came up, you were talking about skill development, or as you mentioned, your economics, right, in that piece. And so one part that usually is attached to global citizenship is the type of skills that we're preparing students to engage with are often tied to the labor market, often tied to, are they prepared to be competitive in the job market? But you both come at it from a much different sort of motivation. And I was wondering, how do you in your work with students balance, or maybe you don't seek to, but there's a pressure to be economically competitive, to prepare students for the workforce. They're competing globally, but yet there's also this very humanistic approach, right, that we also want to have students to value. And I was wondering if both of you would mind speaking to that and the work that you do.
Sure, yeah. I think that's a big piece of it. I know we do in our schools, and I think most schools, they have a lot of character. My husband's also a teacher, and there's a big emphasis on character education. And to me, I think it's priming kids for the corporate world. Be honest, be on time, be responsible, don't steal. And I'm always pushing back on that, because I don't think we should have character education without cornering it with civic education. I think we also need to tell them, how do we show up in the world? How do we show up as citizens? How do we push back against policies that are racist or oppressive or just unacceptable? And so I'm such a big fan of civic education for that reason, because I think that the marketplace, that's not why we have public education. I think we have it's a piece of it, but we have public schools for socio-civic, for our citizenship, for our healthy democracy. We have public education for personal growth and for academic growth, which would lead to a more robust economy. But education's not that one-dimensional. It's not just about priming our kids to be corporate cogs. And so it's just not the paradigm in which I teach. And we talk a lot about the labor market, just child labor, and labor conditions around the world. I've had, dozens and dozens of kids organize hundreds and hundreds of hours around child labor. And in fact, one of my policies in my class is, if you complain about the work, I give them a ton of work. And I say, it's because you can do it, and because you have so much privilege and power, let's exploit that. But if you complain, I double their work. And I always tell them there's 247 million kids that would be loving to sit in the desk that you're sitting at right now, having this day that you have. This just incredible. We spend, what, $6,000 or $7,000 on every child to be sitting here to have all this empowerment. But it's not about, I want them to have great jobs and great skills, but I don't want their lives to be that one-dimensional. You know, I want them to have a sense of the world and sense of themselves and sense of their role in the world beyond, accumulation and generating wealth.
And this is not an issue that is limited to public education. I mean, this is something that at Grinnell we're talking a lot about as college and university education becomes much more focused on questions around employment, which are important, right? There's no doubt about that. But I've come to a place where I think that talking about preparation for employment and preparation for civic life as two different things is itself a bit of a problem, where thinking about the idea of global citizenship really entails developing particular values that I think are going to play out in the kinds of jobs that so many of our students are going to have. So just one very small example. As we look at demographic trends in the United States and the very fact of encountering difference as more and more a part of everyday life for more and more people across the country, I really think about something that I learned right around the time that the current administration tried to roll out the immigration and refugee ban for the first time, which is that the number of physicians in Iowa who are from the countries on the original list of countries, if those physicians were no longer able to be in Iowa, our healthcare system would plunge into immediate crisis. And to prepare our students to be curious about where their doctors are coming from and open to meeting all different kinds of people should something happen to their parents, their grandparents, or to themselves. These are the same values that are going to be essential for a successful professional life, of being able to encounter difference and work with it and through it. And so that's really how I've been thinking more and more about that relationship between preparation for civic life and for professional life. Mm-hmm. These, I would hope, would be one and the same set of values. Right. And that's really how I approach talking with my own students about these questions. I mean, we have an amazing center for helping students think about professional life, and I'm certainly part of that larger effort. But in terms of values, I really hope that our students, both in public schools, but then also in our universities in the state, are thinking very much about the interconnection between these two parts of life.
The other part of that is, it all sounds very good, but yet we also continue to hit these roadblocks as well, whether it's parents or it's administrators. So some of the work that I've looked at, mission statements, school district mission statements across the state of Iowa, these are reviewed every few years, and what I've looked at is this trend, and the word global has popped up more and more, but then when I ask teachers what are they doing in the school that would look like programming related to global, there's not much that's happening. Those schools don't also come with, as you mentioned earlier, a model UN, not that that's any kind of indicator, but they don't have a model UN, or they don't have something beyond what's already in the curriculum to give students those opportunities, or teachers aren't necessarily working with materials that would be bringing in those global perspectives. And so there's the motivation to include global for whatever reason that is a signifier of what's going on in the school or what the school's working towards. But then there's the on-the-ground reality where the teachers are not necessarily being asked to do that type of work, or as we've tried to work on the after-school program as a way to bring that in. The kids have been pretty excited about. Pizza helps, but they've been pretty excited about doing that. And so again, this sort of, one of the questions that you had brought up as we were preparing for this is, what prevents us from people from embracing these? This all sounds very good, yet we still continue to have, these hurdles to get over. Why do you think it is that, as good as this sounds, we still can't, even through education, can't break down these barriers?
Right, what keeps us from, really fully embracing these mission statements and teaching to a global dynamic community, and, what happens? And boy, I mean, from a public, education perspective, well, I don't think every university has Jason Harshman to start off with. I think the training that you do, I didn't receive, back, years ago, and I think that's a part of it, the teacher education. There's very few teachers in my community that have left the country or that speak a second language. So I think that disposition towards globalization, that curiosity, I think we need to start through teacher training and, of course, through our education system as well. But I think that's part of it, is it's a little bit intimidating to teach what you don't know. I hate to teach American history because I don't love it, and it's exhausting to me. And so I avoid it. And I think that that's a piece of it, is that it's intimidating if you haven't been abroad or you don't have that training and you don't have that skill set to try to teach something that's not in your comfort zone, you're just not going to inherently do that. There's so many other demands on our time, and I think that our human brain just gravitates to ease because that's what we do. And so I think that we need more induction in our, in our training, teacher training. And then there's the global citizenship piece, depending on, like, my husband teaches up in Center Point, where it's extremely conservative, so if he said the word global citizenship, and there's so much patriotism there that it might be, threatening to people. It's saying, if, other countries matter, does that mean that the United States matters less? And so I think that patriotism and global citizenship, there's tension between the two.
The point that I was invited to do an entire faculty presentation on global citizenship as a way to, because this has to be done in an interdisciplinary way. It can't just be done in silos. And I was asked a question by a teacher at that district, well, what about reverse social justice? And it's one of those things where I'm a guest here, how do I respond to something that doesn't exist? The other part, yesterday I was invited, we actually had to postpone due to weather, but I was supposed to be up in Cedar Rapids at the Area Educational Association. There are new standards for social studies in the state of Iowa, and 7th grade in particular is global studies. And to your point, I was on the review team for the standards, and the 7th grade received more feedback from the public than any other grade level because of the concerns around teaching global. The course will now be contemporary global issues, and anything that made mention of the environment had a comment attached to it about politics. And we had to cap it at 50 yesterday, even though there were more teachers that wanted to come, because there just isn't that familiarity with U.S. and U.S. government. Most social studies teachers feel very comfortable with. There aren't many that are doing what would be considered a more world or global type of preparation before they go into the classroom. So, but back to your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few things that occur to me, and they're very much informed by having my own child in the Grinnell Newburgh School District, and being pretty active in the district myself. I've been working with a couple of teachers at the elementary level to invite international students at Grinnell College, and we have right around 20% of the students at Grinnell are international students. And this is really an amazing resource for local school districts. And recently I had a conversation with a teacher with whom I've worked quite a bit. And among the students who have visited elementary school classrooms are Muslim students from abroad. We have a good number of students from Pakistan and India and other parts of Muslim majority communities. And this teacher received a fair amount of pushback from parents who wanted to know who these Muslim students were. They wanted to be able to vet people coming into the schools. And that puts a big burden on teachers to be able to push back, and with everything else that is happening, the energy, the kind of emotional energy and time that goes into that it's a big ask. There's no question about that. So local political concerns, I think, play such a significant role in determining what teachers are talking about, not just because teachers themselves might have concerns, but because of interactions with parents. But I also think that approaching things as, right, well, we expect you to start teaching global now, is really intimidating. But I really can't emphasize enough that looking around Iowa, as we've talked about, right, it's not just a world that students want to imagine living in, but looking around Iowa, this world exists around us, and the incredible hospitality that in the past Iowa has displayed has led to really rich refugee communities being here. That's very much part of our history. And so making connections with the larger world in and through Iowa, I think is a really important way to illustrate that global and local discussion need not be totally separate.
Right.
The way that standards are articulated and the expectations that are placed on teachers might make that difficult, thus making the idea of the global so much more intimidating.
We were asked to make sure that we had some time for questions, and I just wanted to make sure that because he came from Grinnell and the project that Caleb and his students have done has been such an inspiration for the work that Alisa and I have been able to do. I've worked with this project, the Mapping Islamophobia project, in my methods course with pre-service teachers, so bringing in digital mapping as well as increasing the amount of time we spent talking about issues of religion and teaching religion. The National Council for the Social Studies in this past year released a statement on the importance of teaching about religion in schools. And so of all the topics that we talk about in social studies, it was religion that the National Council decided that would be become a point of emphasis. So before we turn it over for questions, I was just hoping if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about the Mapping Islamophobia project and the work that you've done with your students.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a project that began in late 2015, and it's received lots and lots of support from the University of Iowa and from Grinnell College. And the idea behind the project originally was to begin documenting things that were affecting American Muslim communities. It has grown a lot since then with a lot of help from my students, a lot of collaboration with my students, and has really expanded to think about how anti-Muslim hostility and Islamophobia affects the nature of American Muslim participation in public life. So if people exist in fear, are they truly able to participate in public life, even in situations like this, right? And thinking about this as public life, freely and voluntarily, which is something that I think a lot of us are privileged to take for granted, right? The idea that we can decide when we want to participate in public life. We can decide what we want to say in public forums. If we go to a school board meeting, that we decide what we want to say and how we want to say it. And in conditions of fear that result from anti-Muslim hostility, which really suffuses political discourse and everyday interactions that a lot of American Muslims have, really asking this question of how something like anti-Muslim hostility relates to core American values of democratic life. That this is really where the project has gone. So it both documents what is happening around us and hopefully spurs people to ask questions about, like, well, how does this really affect not just American Muslim communities, but the United States as a whole, and our capacity to function well as a democratic community.
And one of the pieces that I was able to take, or many, and Alisa mentioned this around media literacy, is when I brought this into the social studies pre-service teacher classroom, we focused on issues around Islam to bring a global perspective. So we looked at Kenya, having done some research around comparativeness and populations and issues there. And what I asked the students to do was to work only with sources that are being produced in Kenya. So very much like the sourcing that was done by Caleb and his students around the mapping Islamophobia. And for my students, it was the first time that they had worked with sources produced exclusively outside of the United States. And so it became very much that sort of modeling with them and working with them to do the type of skill building we want their students to then be able to do, and to be able to go through sources, go to the editorial board, go through their process, all pieces of the project that Caleb has done, so that it's not just a news source, but it really has been vetted and being able to follow up. And that's added a whole nother dimension to how we do how we have these conversations with pre-service teachers around the skills that they're teaching, but also developing them themselves in the teacher education classroom. And that's, again, what we're doing with the junior high students as well, as they do their sourcing and doing mapping. Just yesterday, we were looking at or Tuesday, we were looking at quotes, and the student had found a quote that he really liked, but again, asking and we asked him, how do you know that I didn't make that a half an hour ago and just post it online? So again, asking him to return and go back through the process to find out if that's something we really want to put as part of our public project. So.
Just before we open it up, I just want to thank the two of you for bringing this into public school classrooms. This was one of the real goals that I had for the project, was to create something that was for educators and journalists and people outside of colleges and universities. And watching these projects unfold has really helped me understand how it might work. So I appreciate that very much.
We appreciate the work that you gave us, the material, yeah.
So I guess I think, Jennifer, will open it up to the floor if anybody has some questions.
Seriously? Do I need a microphone?
It's being filmed, so that's to pick up your voice for the,
Okay.
yeah.
I hope this isn't too simplistic, but Caleb, could you describe more concretely what your project looked like, what it consisted of? You said your students did projects, and you described sort of the topical nature of them.
Mm-hmm.
Was it a website that they did projects and posted them? And then what happened? So could you describe, I get the sense that there were 3 steps to this.
Yeah.
Could you describe that more concretely?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So the foundation of the whole project is really watching media coverage quite closely and collecting as much data that we can about anti-Muslim hostility and American Muslim participation in public life, things like interfaith outreach, open mosque events, Ask a Muslim events, all the things that people in American Muslim communities do to humanize themselves, right, to address these larger conditions. And from that, we are creating really large data sets to document all of this. Those data sets then populate over a dozen maps on a website, mappingislamophobia.org, that separates the data in different ways. So people can look at all of this data by year, or by the type of incident or activity, or by the gender of those affected. So we've broken out the data in all different kinds of ways for people to play around with and access. And each data point on a map, so the map consists of lots of dots, and each of those dots represents some kind of incident or activity. And depending on what we're trying to do with the data, sometimes they're different colors to illustrate different kinds of activities or incidents. But each data point is also clickable. And if you click on the data point, then you actually get the story behind the data point. So you learn about the person who was affected, for example, by an anti-Muslim incident.
And so the story is something that is written about it, or the story is part of the link?
So
The student has written about it?
So we present some basic information. So, for example, we present the date that it occurred, and based on news reports, we write a short description, and then there's always a link to our source. So we want everything to be really transparent, and if the user wants to read more, they just have to use the URL or the web address that's in the little bubble that pops up if you click. So everything that we use is really accessible. And actually all of our data, all the data sets, all that stuff is freely downloadable on the website.
And then so Caleb and I worked last summer at the Obermann Center to do the planning of how that would then move into a classroom. And so I began with the teacher education classroom and doing the steps. So everything that Caleb just laid out in terms of not just the plotting and using the digital mapping, but then also the sourcing process as well as a way for our students to learn how to teach that type of literacy to eventually high school and junior high students. They created their own map project as well. So they were doing the digital mapping as well as the sourcing. Together, we led a teacher workshop for Iowa teachers in October. That was a two-day workshop that we did, and that was part of the conversation as well. And then starting in December, we then took it to the junior high level. And we've been doing a version of that project at the junior high level where the students are doing both the mapping as well as taking a look at the cultural diversity of what it means to be Muslim. And so that's been driven very much by student interest. So they're looking at movies and music and sports and putting a digital video together. We actually took a trip to public access television a few weeks ago to give the students a tour of the television studio, and then they're going to use the studio to do their editing as well to be as part of that. And I don't know if you want to mention a couple weeks ago when we went to the public forum.
Right, yeah. So, yeah, we've organized this group into 3 entities. We've got the mapping Islamophobia, and then we have the cultural geographers, and then I lead up the Geographus. It's a term that Jason came up
We
with.
combine geographers and activists for that, yeah.
And I've got the fun group. I have a great group of kids, and they all wrote speeches, and we went to a legislative forum that was held at the ESC at our district headquarters. And it was intended, I thought it was going to be in the context of education, and school board members would be there. And it pretty much was a little bit different, but they made space for the kids. They all got up and they spoke, and they had school board members from, 5 or 6 different school districts. And then they had their own state legislators, the state Senate and House there, and a couple others. And they spoke out in favor of an ethnic studies course that's being pursued here in the Iowa City School District. And they spoke out in favor of expanding our calendar, our school calendar to include Islamic holidays. And what was the third thing? Is it ethnic studies, holidays?
Oh, and then just, again, looking at programming around reducing prejudice, reducing
That's right.
bias
Yeah.
within the school. So being a little bit more open about those conversations.
And they had all these statistics. They said 1 in every, was it 5
Yeah.
people, you know?
So so based on the research that they had been doing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, so we have a question here, and then a question over here, and then here.
Yeah. So when I think about these matters of, who could be a real American, or what's a hate crime, or what is or isn't Islamophobia, to my mind, these are political questions. They're not the kind of questions like, is there climate change, or, do vaccinations work or not? And if you accept that they're political questions, then to take a side is to be a partisan. And I think if that's true, we should own that. But it does raise some questions about, public schools where we have representative democracy, and to some degree, majorities have more say, and not absolute. I mean, obviously, there's some minimal protections for minorities, but how do we weigh that out? I mean, if we're frankly, being cosmopolitan in Iowa is a minority position, and if we're public employees working for public systems, what's sort of the stance in terms of choosing, the public good and being representatives of the public versus maybe our personal agendas, if you will.
I'm sorry, is the question about the place of the teacher in the teaching of this, and the politics of a teacher who introduces this in the classroom?
Certainly that, and also being parents and concerned citizens, and it's I think, first of all, just putting out there that I think it's to take a partisan position to push for global citizenship or cosmopolitanism, and then if we own that, what does that mean in terms of tactics, but also in terms of our thinking about what's our responsibilities as publicly paid citizens or just citizens.
I don't know if you want to.
I know. I have this little quote on my desk that says, an effective teacher is going to protect her students from her own biases. And I really do attempt to do that. And if I am expressing a bias, I try to out myself right away. So when we talk about wars, I said, I'm just going to be clear that I am a pacifist. So, and my intention is not to indoctrinate you or to make you pacifist. But as I present this, if you hear that undertone, I'm outing myself right now. So, but I think you're absolutely right. And I think that there's a lot of fear because of that. All right, the separation of church and state and separation of, and the indoctrination laws, that I think that keeps a lot of teachers from teaching too. And that was one of the questions you asked, what keeps us? There's a lot of fear around breaching those lines. But I also think it's so important to teach it that you take those risks. And I'll get hits from, I've been told that I'm too conservative by some parents and too liberal by other parents. And, I've been in 3 different buildings, and so it depends on the climate, But overwhelmingly, the feedback I get from parents is that they really love, we just had conferences last night, and I just told my husband, it was like the most rewarding set of conferences because a parent, one after another, and I don't know where they fall on the spectrum, but they said their kids are coming home and just having conversations and asking questions and really curious about the world and curious about global issues more than they've ever been, and that they're starting to take action and inspired to get involved, whether it's gun rights or, March for Our Lives, but that they want to get more involved. And so I hope if I'm effective, I'm not telling the kids what issues to work on, but how to know what they care about and what to do to create that world. Let them have the political skills, the hands-on skills, raising awareness skills, whether it's pro-choice, pro-life. It's really not to indoctrinate. I've taken kids to dozens and dozens of legislative forums over the years, and they've talked about supporting Walmart, and they've talked about animal rights, and they pick their issue, and I help them to frame their question. So I think there's a way. I've never been in trouble for indoctrination. I've had a couple of parents say, this is, like especially when we do like the Iraq War, ask for more balance, and then I brought more balance on board. And so it's a tricky line that we dance. But my hope is that at some point we have in our teaching profession the skills and the disposition towards teaching it in spite of the fears. I think that we're compromised, we're paralyzed by fear around it, and then look at our civic literacy today. We're sometimes laughed around the world by how little we know about our government and how to show up in our government. So I really think that it's urgent that we teach it. We take those professional risks, and maybe we will get in trouble, but and then we recalibrate and we change it. But I think we still need to teach it.
So we have 2 other questions identified, and we have 5 minutes, so we're going to go into our speed round. Okay?
May I just say something
Yeah.
very quickly? So in mapping Islamophobia, we've made a very conscious choice to include material that is only from media organizations that have a very clear editorial chain of command and policy to demonstrate that what we are presenting are events that have taken place that had an explicit anti-Muslim animus. And so there's no way to inoculate the project entirely from claims about fake news and hoaxes, but we have done everything possible to demonstrate that we are presenting empirical data.
And that's what we've transferred in with the pre-service teachers as well, that same process, so that should similar questions be asked of what they're doing in the classroom, they're able to walk through and be able to say, this is what we're doing with students. So when a student decides to include this in their project and their topic, here's how we got here. It wasn't just me handing them this.
And it turns out this question was close enough that we're ceding the microphone.
Hi, great. I was born and raised here post-World War II and Cold War era, and, you know, Khrushchev came to Iowa at a time when, you know, the Cold War was at its highest, and, you know, who knew Russia, and oh my goodness, you know, the big bad people were coming, but it opened up an era of exploration and information and sharing and exchange that, you know, invited everybody everywhere in the state to try to learn more and to understand more. And it seemed that it was during a time when we were nicer to each other. And I'm just going to ask you to speak a little bit about that, because I actually take a different perspective from the question that we just had. And it's, people have changed. We are not as nice to each other. We are not as open to one another. I don't know if we would welcome Putin to come look at corn on a farm, you know, and to talk about feeding people in the world today. But people were really honored to have that world leader come and look at our corn and hold us up at a high standard. And there were lots of things that happened. And my sister and I were just reading an article about Columbus Junction in the Iowan, about how Columbus Junction has been saved by the cultural diversity that now lives in that community, and it's all over. So I don't know how we do anything other than teach global citizenry and understand who we are, as we are all current global citizens. It's not 50, 70 years ago. It's impossible. And so I'd like you to speak a little bit more about kind of bridging what you've discussed in your classroom and in your training and your specific models to the broader global citizen movement. You know, we wouldn't have the challenge with refugees and asylum seekers if everybody understood that we're global citizens. We live on the earth. We are members of the world. And we can be nice to each other. But can you speak to that, really, the more broad issue?
Any thoughts? You want to start?
I just think there's a lot of fear. I think my dad once, he was an anti-establishmentarian, I'll preface that, but he said, we will always have an external threat. If it's not the communists, now it's the terrorists. And I think that we're fed a heavy diet of fear. And I think that's so alienating, and the connection is scary. On Tuesday after we met, the custodian came and he asked complaints because we spill apple cider and pizza. And I said, but Al, let me tell you about this project. We're working to combat Islamophobia. And he goes, what? And I go, yeah. I said, they're the kindest people I've never met. You know, I've been all over North Africa and Middle East, and I've never had a bad experience. He goes, well, you just haven't met that one. You never know which one. I think there's just so much fear. And I think that as a part of my teaching, and I want to raise that consciousness to challenge that fear, because behind that fear, there's an agenda. And I think there's an agenda. We spend $27,000 a second on war and war preparation, you know, to fight wars that we can't define, we can't defend, we can't explain, and we can't win. But somebody's making a ton of money. And I think that that's, you know, like, we got to follow the money and follow the fear and push back. I think that lack of kindness and connection is really strongly based in fear. And I think that we're really, I don't know, I think it's intentional.
Just really quickly, a couple of things come to mind. One, why are we not more welcoming? At least for the last 30-odd years in the United States, political discourse has been dominated by discussions of scarcity, of not having enough to make do, and questions about the role of government in people's lives, and I think that has poisoned the well. And initiatives that governments might take, both, especially at the federal level, to initiate the kinds of contacts that you're talking about, are seen with significant suspicion. And if the larger political discourse is one of scarcity, that we don't have enough, then I think the sense that people arriving are going to be taking away from what we have is a huge motivation behind attitudes that we're seeing now around refugees that we weren't even seeing 20 years ago when Bosniaks began arriving. Now, I think with that particular case, I would be curious to know whether Muslims of color would have been welcomed in quite the same way as Muslims from Europe. were welcomed. But nonetheless, I think it's really these two things, questions about scarcity and suspicion around initiatives that the federal government might undertake to, in fact, promote the kind of hospitality and welcoming that you're talking about. I'm not sure that that kind of exchange program would happen now. So those are the two things that come to mind immediately for me.
Yeah, I think underlying that piece too is our students have a lot of access to information. And this is not meant to come out as a blame because we all have access to information. But when working in the classrooms, that's a lot of responsibility for teachers to be able to hit all of these pieces and get to assessment and make sure that everybody's, fed and getting through the day. So even the topic of global citizenship education puts a lot of pressure on teachers as if teachers are the only conduits to this information and the only ways in which that this is going to be learned and engaged with. And so there's that piece of it that I think is a way that is not necessarily giving full range to what we have access to. So there's that. But I think also with this with the media consumption pieces is that fear that when one image, one story over and over and over, to get students to just shift a little bit, and this it's an ongoing process. So we know even when I've had the fortune to be able to connect one classroom here with a classroom in another part of the world, for 40 minutes it's great, but if it stops, if that's it, then we know we've had a nice opportunity, but we haven't done anything that's sustained. And so while I see the 7th grade classroom as an opportunity now, that can all go away by 8th grade. That can all go away if the English teacher isn't on board. That can all go away if, to the point raised earlier about politics, if that prejudice is made known in that classroom space. So, there isn't a silver bullet for sure, but I think I get to spend a lot of time in classrooms. I am hopeful. I really am, because we've seen just once a week, hour and a half, but repeatedly we've been able to make we've had some contacts with the Muslim Student Association here with our students. I'm hopeful. I really am. I think it's too easy to look at all of it and say, and I think I'm not the only one that sometimes go home and turn on the news and then 30 seconds later have to turn it off because it's just emotionally not good. I am hopeful. I really, really am.
And I just want to briefly add to that. One thing that I have seen is that I don't think it would be possible to ask more of American Muslims in terms of the outreach that they're doing to humanize themselves. That I have found the rate of these kinds of activities is really mind-boggling. And the maps bear this out, right? If you look at this data mapped. And so addressing this fear, I think, really does require allies outside of American Muslim communities to be doing this kind of work in classrooms. Because of the fact of the matter is, at 1% of the population, if that, not every American is going to meet a Muslim. It's impossible. And to have that expectation and place that burden on American Muslim communities, I think is a little overwhelming. So these kinds of programs that aren't dependent on the labor of American Muslims to do this work, I think are especially significant.
And the other piece is, how do we get kids to care? That's always a question for any educator. How do we get a student to care about this? And particularly in talking about these issues, we're asking them to care about people that they may never meet, that face-to-face not interact with. And so this idea of interconnectedness, but also we talk quite a bit about interdependence. And so the actions that you take, what are the ramifications of it, but also being reflective about what you do and is the action to now stop and take that kind of that responsibility. So that's also something too as a consumer culture, talking with students about that and their responsibilities to people that that they may never interact with, but by some way or fortune, they may end up impacting or being impacted by.
Thank you very much, all three of you, and thank you for the great questions as well.
Do you mind, I brought a poem to close with.
Yeah,
Is
that'd
that,
be
is that
lovely.
okay?
Yeah.
I have a class to go to, but I trust him. So I wanted to close with a poem that I was reminded of after of the bombing last weekend in Syria, and what also has just continued to be happening in Yemen, but is not getting the coverage. And so this is a poem by Ilya Kaminsky, who was born in the former Soviet Union, and he lost most of his hearing by the age of 4. And he sought political asylum in the United States with his family in 1993, and they ended up settling in Rochester, New York. I taught high school in Rochester, New York, not at that time, but I had family in Rochester, New York. And so I know I traveled to Rochester in 1993, but I certainly did not go under these conditions that Ilya and his family moved to Rochester, New York. He went on to Georgetown and started an organization called Poets for Peace. And so I wanted to close, if you don't mind, with this short poem. He published this poem in 2013, and the poem is entitled, "We Lived Happily During the War." And I will come back to the thoughts of interconnectedness and interdependency with this poem. So again, Ilya Kaminsky's 2013 poem, "We Lived Happily During the War." And when they bombed other people's houses, we protested, but not enough. We opposed them, but not enough. I was in my bed. Around my bed, America was falling. Invisible house by invisible house by invisible house. I took a chair outside and watched the sun. In the 6th month of a disastrous reign in the house of money, in the street of money, in the city of money, in the country of money, our great country of money, we, forgive us, lived happily during the war. Thank you all very much for coming out tonight. Have a good, safe, and peaceful evening.